So you can say, I want to be authentic to what that incident was, but that's authentic to 6 different people who were sitting in the room. So that all I can really do is try to figure out what would be the bigger umbrella, the emotional truth that was going on in that room.
I do a lot of research, and the different things I've worked on, from West Wing to Homeland to the Diplomat, I'll do a lot of research. And by research, that means speaking to people in the positions that can tell you the truth about what goes on, so that you're being accurate. And the goal has really been to be as accurate as possible, start with accuracy. And every once in a while, they'll tell you something, you'll go, oh, okay, that's a little uninteresting. Like one example is that I was told that if there was an emergency behind the U.S. ambassador's house for the season finale of season 2 of The Diplomat, that there'd be like 8 agents running to Grace Penn. And I was like, well, it should be more like 20, So I did change it from 8 to 20 because it wasn't visually dramatic. But that's like the biggest change I made recently in anything I've done, because normally you're interviewing people and you're trying to find out what happens, because you're not only trying to get it right, but what really happens is usually more interesting than anything anybody can write. Like Diplomat, the storylines are very much based on this is what would happen. I'm doing a storyline in the opening of season 4. Almost the whole story is just what would happen in a scenario if that scenario happened. It's completely accurate and based on like what would play out.
So easiest for me to talk about the West Wing, which was something that I was able to help set up from the very beginning by being part of the process. And in that case, the greatest research I was able to do was I was fortunate enough to spend 2 nights in the Lincoln bedroom, unrelated to the West Wing. During the Clinton administration, hadn't met Aaron yet, didn't know that I would ever do a show. And those 2 days that I was there and was invited into the West Wing, where I spent time, what I felt during that period, those 2 days, the son of an immigrant, the idea that I was spending 2 nights in this place that I just couldn't imagine that I would ever visit, let alone be able to spend the night there and have meals with the president and the first lady. Everything that I felt is what got translated in the show. Everything that I felt as a person to what I wanted the audience to feel. That's a little different than the research that I would also then do to build the world, to construct the world, to be part of the storytelling of that world. And what I've often said, both in the West Wing and even in Manhattan, a show that I did, which was about the recreation of Los Alamos and building the first atomic bomb, was that Ragtime is maybe, I think, my favorite novel. And the reason that I love Ragtime so much is what I believe he did was he married in an incredible way sort of fiction and nonfiction. So there were very real people in Ragtime, and then there were completely fictionalized people in Ragtime. But what he did was he created a truth about the whole thing that was what Ragtime was defined as, the essence of that period of time. And so to me, because I can't completely define the word authenticity, I kind of know it when I see it, but everybody has a kind of a different point of view of any incident. So you can say, I want to be authentic to what that incident was, but that's authentic to 6 different people who were sitting in the room. So that all I can really do is try to figure out what would be the bigger umbrella, the emotional truth that was going on in that room. Everybody feeling different, but what took place? What was the true obstacle in that particular scene that they had to get past? That's what I spend so much time working on. I read a lot. I do a lot of research. I try to talk to as many people who have been part of that world. We went to Washington, D.C. We interviewed a lot of congressmen at that time who thought we were crazy to do a show about politics is never going to work. You're never going to get it right. We were in Bernie Frank's office, I remember, and he was eating a sandwich and there was food on his shirt, and it was like he had stacks of newspaper and it was chaos in that room. And I went, wow, this was at 10 in the morning and he's probably already worked a good 5 hours. And it went, I don't care what he's saying. He's giving me so much about how important this is to what he's doing. And the last thing he wanted was, you guys are going to go fuck it up now. And what you got was everybody cared. And this was, remember, a different time. But what you did get at that moment was everybody, wherever we were talking, cared deeply about what they were doing. They were making mistakes here and there, and they understood they were making mistakes, but they cared. That's what got translated. And that's what I'm talking about, emotional truth. Because you would talk to, people who were fans of the show who worked in government, and they would often go, there's never that many people in the hallways, and there's more people in the meetings. And I would go, yeah, we can afford extras, but we can't afford more regulars. But we understand that at least that idea was that things were moving around. Because when I was there, when I spent those 2 days there, I felt like everything that was passing me by was important. Now, I know George Stephanopoulos and Cisneros were probably talking about whether to have a turkey sandwich or tuna fish sandwich for lunch, but I thought they were talking about India and Pakistan. I just thought no matter what, this is important, whatever they're doing. And that became part of the texture of the show.
Well, as a director, you're trying to portray the story in an accurate way. I mean, especially if it's a modern political thriller or a historical political thriller, you try to research how the accuracy of how things would be presented. What does the location look like? What do the uniforms look like? How do people address each other? You try to find ranks, especially if there's military involved. You make sure that the ranks are accurate. We, Designated Survivor, we had a lot of different generals and things discussing things with the president, and that was always, we had 12 different military members in the room trying to maintain accuracy on who would speak first and who could speak to the president. And that was always a test. But I think you do have a responsibility to try to tell the story accurately and lay the groundwork for that. Especially on Designated Survivor, we had Secret Service advisors, military advisors, and we were lucky enough that it seemed like everyone in those branches enjoyed the show. So they were very helpful when we needed them. Designated Survivor happens every State of the Union, right? It does happen. The other part doesn't happen where the government is destroyed. But the continuance of government is something that's really dear to American politics, and that's where the story came from, I think, for them. And they tried to maintain a lot of accuracy when faced with global events and national events on the show. And we would always defer to the realism of what was taking place in the White House, sometimes before taking dramatic license. And we were lucky enough to have someone as intelligent as Cal Penn, who was actually starring in the show and was actually on Obama's. He worked for Obama in the White He took a break from acting and went to the White House. And so we had him right there to help us, who could be in the Rose Garden? How would people move through this door? What's behind this wall? He was a big part of the show that way.
On Madam Secretary, the writers wisely engaged a company called Glover Park, which was at that time a bipartisan group that worked with nonprofits and companies around the world. And they would point us towards a lot of growing stories that would soon burst into the headlines, which allowed our writers to be ahead of the curve. And I would then contact them with specific questions about behavior, protocol, and how it functioned, so that I could then give the actors the parameters of the playground and say, you can't get this close, but you can speak your mind from here, and here's how you would behave in a situation historically. And I found that always helped the actors.
Well, the minute I'm doing something that is based on reality, I jump in and do every kind of research I can. I read everything. I watch documentaries. I don't want to leave any stone unturned that I have access to. That includes meeting with experts from the field, people that have lived that experience. And again, it's all fair game, because I want to know as much as I can, because if you are dealing with something that is reality-based, you want to be sure you have the understanding of the reality. And if you are changing things because of the narrative of the story, to be very aware of that and responsible to that. And I think it's really important for filmmakers and storytellers to do that.
I don't change things very often. And the truth is we don't really change things. You'll just sort of adjust. It's usually, I'm going to do something and take dramatic licenses, an adjustment to what would happen. It's not changing, because you don't want to go, this would never happen, but let's do it. You want to go, this would happen, but it'd be a little more blue than that, or a little faster than that. Or another thing that I think happens more often than not is you say, this happens faster than it would happen. There'd be 20 phone calls and it would take 4 days. Well, we're going to do it over the course of the day. But what happens is what would happen. It's just happening in a shorter amount of time. That's a very good example of like the kinds of change that would be made. But you're not changing the truth of what happens. You're just sort of changing, say, the time frame. The season premiere of season 3 of The Diplomat, where Grace Penn is in the UK as the vice president when the president has a heart attack and dies and she becomes president. That first premiere was just literally like, this is the scenario they've worked out and rehearsed of what would happen if a vice president was in a foreign country when the president died. And that became the story. The research was the story.
I think you have to be enormously sensitive to how far you take those liberties. So those liberties aren't taken so far that then you're in some sort of fantasy land, that would never exist, that couldn't exist. But boy, it looks cool, or it would be really fun to do. But if it compromised the characters and compromised the situation and compromised the world you're trying to build, then you shouldn't do it.
Some shows, when you work on them, they don't care about accuracy. They're just like, what looks cool. Designated Survivor was not like that, and our show Deputy was not like that. Realism came first for the most part, because once people believe that they're there, believe that it could happen, any dramatic license that's going on in an amplified story that you're telling becomes easier to be brought along on as an audience member, I think.
I would certainly read it, and I would look for the strong opposition to the issue that was being examined and try and boost that so that you had conflict, because otherwise the script won't be as interesting, or the story won't be as interesting. And if it wasn't as pronounced as it could have been, then the actors could sometimes let their emotions out in a way that might not have been appropriate in the situation, but would help the story become more dynamic.
It's absolutely a balancing act between being responsible to the reality and telling a story. And you want to keep that in balance and servicing the characters. You have to relate to the characters you're dealing with, or not relate to them. You know, you're telling a story. We are storytellers, but I do feel a huge responsibility. I mean, again, every project I've worked on, I suppose it goes back to the idea of wanting to be in the back rooms of power where decisions are made. And I don't have that access in real life. I can't sit in, a meeting of, in the sit room when they're discussing like classified information. I would love to be there, but I can have access to those people who have sat in that room, in that circumstance, and try to do it, if it's being portrayed, in the most realistically real way. I mean, one of the things that we did when I was on Homeland as the executive producer director for so many seasons is every year the creators of the show, Alex Gansa and Howard Gordon, and all the writing staff, and Claire Danes and Mandy Patinkin, we would all go to DC and meet with the heads of the CIA, NSA, DNI, State Department, investigative journalists, paramilitary, generals, and basically Alex Gansa would ask the question, what keeps you up at night? What are your deepest fears for America and the world? And that's where the new season would come from. And that was totally extraordinary to be part of that process. So we didn't know from season to season what the story would be until after that session. I mean, you have the bigger kind of macro world of politics and what's going on specifically in the world you're talking about. And then you have the interpersonal, you have the characters, and it has to have that balance. You know, you have to be seeing it, I think, from a clear point of view. In the case of Homeland, it was Carrie Matheson. It was Claire Danes' character. Oftentimes that you were seeing the world. I think with Zero Day, the last political thriller I directed, also based heavily on research and reality, but a situation where that exact thing had not happened. It was a bit of a what if based on very factual research of different cyber attacks that have happened, but there had never been one that happened in every industry simultaneously. So extending that reality and looking at what our response would be to that. You know, and we're living in a world where it's a post-truth world. We don't all agree on what is fact and what is opinion, and it asks that very important question. But again, you have to see it through the prism of your characters.
All the President's Men.
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 All the President's Men managed to, when I first saw it, I saw it on video, and I immediately, I realized my parents had the book on their bookshelf. And so I sat down, I read the whole book, and it was fascinating as a young, filmmaker sort of in training to see how accurate the movie is, which is incredibly accurate to the book, but how he took the key moments that advanced the story out of the book and made that the movie. And then all the nitty gritty other, maybe B or C level storylines were in the book, but they weren't in the movie because they weren't, they didn't advance the story as tightly. And what's funny to me about that film, like any great film, is I've loved it since I was 18, and I can watch it now, and it's better now even than it was then. It holds up so well, and the magic of that, and it's just excellent.
Well, look, I give away a little bit my age, but that's not that hard to figure it out. But, I so grew up in the 70s political thrillers. So the idea of The Parallax View, All the President's Men, both Alan Pakula, both Gordon Willis are pretty much the sort of standard for me of that sort of paranoid political thriller that was kind of edge of your seat. All the President's Men is just such an amazing film because everyone who at the time that was made was watching it knew what the outcome was. So you're making a story that everybody knows the ending, and that you're never thinking about that throughout the whole story. You're just completely involved in the process. I would say more contemporary, which is not that contemporary, was quite a few years ago, The Lives of Others is an amazing film, sort of the German film. And then I think not because I was lucky enough to work on it, but I think what Joe and Joel did with The Americans was kind of an incredible, because the best of all of these things. Parallax View is about Warren Beatty, about what's happening to him personally. All the President's Men are these two kids that are just, realizing we're onto the story. They don't know yet they're part of history. They don't have any idea about that. It's such human drama. And I think the idea of this human drama about marriage and about what family is and about what it means to be an American under the umbrella of this, espionage story and spy story. And I remember the first time I would go there, I'd go, how do I protect Carrie and Matthew, the characters, and I'm going, wait, they're the fucking Russians. They're the bad guys. What am I doing? It's because it got all mixed up. So I just think they did an incredible job on that show.
Well, I love The Parallax View with Warren Beatty. I love that movie. I like All the President's Men. I love Zero Dark 30, modern ones. I'll get pulled into shows like The Night Agent. The first season of The Night Agent I've seen, and I just like when something's based on the premise of, when the nugget is something real, and then it blows up into something exaggerated and brings us along for a ride. But I like shows like that too.
From the 1960s, I'm a huge fan of The Battle of Algiers, Pontecorvo, and Z, Costa Garvas. I love Missing. Oh my God, it's just emotional and political and vibrant to this day. It remains a wonderful film. And then the 70s, the US really, I think Nixon really inspired us. The Conversation, The Parallax View, All the President's Men, the Fourth Estate acting as an investigator that revealed the corruption that then led to change. That was, those are different times.
I'm going to go back to the one thing I watch, the classic film that I watch. I watch it so many times, it's crazy. I could probably speak all the dialogue, which is All the President's Men. If you want to talk about a political thriller that so gets it right, it's here you have a story based on something that happened, that the ending. There's no doubt about how it ends. And every step of the way, I am on pins and needles, like thinking, maybe the end will be different. Maybe something else will happen. That is just superb storytelling on every level. So to me, that you don't get better than that. There are great political thrillers out there, but that to me is the one I go to. Another one, which is not quite a political thriller, but kind of is The Insider, where again, you've got a whistleblower, and how do we deal with truth? Who stands up and who doesn't? And two amazing films.